He thought power made him untouchable. In a quiet restaurant where people like him were always served first and questioned last, a wealthy man decided to turn language into a weapon. A few foreign words, spoken with a smirk, were meant to shrink a black waitress down to silence, to remind her where he believed she belonged. She stood there, calm and professional, carrying more than just a tray on her shoulders. What he didn't realize was that his moment of mockery was about to expose something far deeper than arrogance, and when the truth surfaced, the room would never feel the same again. She had learned early how to move through the world without drawing attention to herself. Each morning followed the same rhythm, an early commute, a pressed uniform, and the quiet mental preparation required to face strangers who would never bother to learn her name. Working as a waitress in a high-end restaurant wasn't her dream, but it was stable, and stability mattered. The dining room was polished and elegant, filled with soft music and unspoken rules about who belonged and who simply served. To most customers, she was invisible unless something went wrong. Plates were delivered, orders were taken, smiles were offered on cue. She carried herself with calm professionalism, even when the air felt heavy with judgment. Few people knew anything about her life beyond the apron, about the years of education, the sacrifices, or the constant effort it took to remain composed in spaces that weren't built for her comfort. That day began like any other. The restaurant buzzed with quiet confidence, the kind that comes with wealth and exclusivity. She moved between tables, attentive and efficient, already sensing which guests demanded extra care and which ones saw kindness as weakness. Experience had taught her to read the room quickly, to anticipate tension before it surfaced. But there was something different about one table. The man seated there carried himself with deliberate confidence, the kind that didn't need to be announced. His presence shifted the energy around him, drawing attention without asking for it. She approached, as she always did, professional, composed, prepared. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary moment, in an otherwise routine shift, was about to test everything she had learned about patience, dignity, and restraint. And that a quiet decision made in seconds would soon turn an act of subtle cruelty into an unforgettable reckoning. The shift moved forward with practiced ease, but the atmosphere around that table grew heavier by the minute. The man's confidence wasn't loud, it was calculated. Every gesture, every pause felt intentional, as if he were testing the limits of the space and the people in it. When she reached his table, the usual routine began, yet something subtle changed. His eyes lingered, not with interest, but with judgment, the kind that weighed a person without permission. He responded to her professionalism with something cold and deliberate. His order came out in a language that clearly wasn't meant to communicate, it was meant to exclude. The tone carried amusement, a private joke, meant for himself. Nearby diners glanced up, some confused, others quietly entertained. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and in that silence, the imbalance of power became unmistakable. She recognized the tactic immediately. It wasn't about food or language, it was about control. He assumed she would stumble, that she would ask for clarification, that she would shrink under the weight of embarrassment. People like him relied on that hesitation. And as the seconds passed, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the familiar outcome. Her posture stayed steady, but internally the tension tightened. Years of similar moments pressed forward, times when dignity had to be swallowed to keep the peace, moments when responding meant risking more than silence ever would. She could feel the attention shifting, eyes quietly measuring her reaction. The restaurant's elegance suddenly felt fragile, like a stage set for humiliation. The man leaned back, satisfied with the discomfort he believed he'd created. To him, this was harmless entertainment, a reminder of hierarchy, a reminder of who held power and who was expected to endure. The quiet cruelty of it lingered, magnified by the setting that pretended to be refined. But what he didn't understand was that his assumption rested on ignorance. He saw only a uniform and a role, not the life behind it. He had no idea how much she had learned simply by navigating worlds that demanded adaptation. No idea how often she had been underestimated and how prepared she was for moments like this. As she stood there, the tension thickened further. A manager hovered at a distance, sensing discomfort but unwilling to intervene too soon. Other guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something far more deliberate. The moment teetered between dismissal and exposure. This wasn't just about one customer anymore. It was about the quiet permission society often gives to subtle acts of disrespect, the kind that hides behind accents, wealth, and plausible deniability, the kind that leaves the victim carrying the emotional cost alone. And as she prepared to respond, the balance of the room began to change. What had started as a private act of mockery was on the verge of becoming something public, something undeniable. Because the next few seconds would determine whether this moment ended the way it always had, or whether it would finally turn the power dynamic on its head. The moment crystallized under the weight of expectation. What had begun as a quiet insult now demanded an answer, and the room seemed to lean forward, waiting. The man's confidence hardened into certainty. He had already decided how this would end, another subtle victory, another reminder that power didn't need to raise its voice to be felt. But instead of retreating, she remained still. Her calm unsettled the rhythm of the space. The seconds stretched, and with them, the illusion that this was a harmless misunderstanding began to fracture. Something shifted in the air, sharp and undeniable. The cruelty that had been wrapped in sophistication was suddenly exposed, stripped of its disguise. When she responded, it wasn't hurried or defensive. It was precise, effortless. The same foreign language he had used to diminish her now flowed back with clarity and control, followed seamlessly by another and then another. What he believed was a private joke became a public reckoning. The imbalance he relied on collapsed in real time. Faces around the room changed, curiosity turned into disbelief, amusement faded into discomfort. The man's posture stiffened as realization set in. The power he thought he held slipped through his fingers, replaced by something far more unsettling. The awareness that he had underestimated the very person he tried to humiliate. In that instant, the restaurant was no longer a stage for quiet superiority. It became a mirror. His wealth, his status, his assumptions, all reflected back at him, hollow and exposed. The silence that followed was heavier than the mockery that came before it. It carried judgment, not from her alone, but from everyone who had witnessed the exchange. For her, the moment wasn't about triumph. It was about reclaiming space, about refusing to be reduced to a role others felt entitled to define. Years of restraint, of swallowing indignities for survival, converged into a single, undeniable truth. She was never powerless. And as the weight of that realization settled over the room, one question lingered in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. When arrogance is finally confronted with truth, who is left exposed? The moment didn't end with applause or confrontation. It ended with awareness. The man's certainty dissolved into quiet discomfort, and the room slowly returned to motion, though nothing felt the same. Orders resumed, plates were cleared, but the shift in energy lingered. For her, the rest of the day passed differently. She moved with the same professionalism, yet something inside her had settled. Not pride, not victory, clarity. She had met disrespect without surrendering her dignity, and that mattered. When her shift finally ended, the weight she carried felt lighter. The incident didn't change her life overnight, but it changed how she saw herself in spaces that had always demanded restraint. She was reminded that silence is often mistaken for weakness, and that assumptions can collapse when met with truth. What was meant to diminish her instead revealed the limits of arrogance. Beyond that restaurant, the moment reflected something far larger. Racism doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it hides behind accents, wealth, or polite smiles. It disguises itself as humor, sophistication, or harmless misunderstanding, and too often it relies on the belief that the person on the receiving end will absorb the insult quietly and move on. But stories like this expose the flaw in that belief. They remind us that those who are underestimated often carry histories, skills, and strength that remain unseen till the moment they are forced into the light. The real discomfort isn't caused by being corrected, it's caused by realizing how wrong the assumptions were in the first place. This wasn't just a story about language or intelligence. It was about dignity, about reclaiming space in a world that frequently denies it. And it leaves a question worth sitting with: how many moments like this go unnoticed every day, and what would change if they didn't? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect, share it. Start a conversation, because awareness is where change begins, and silence only protects the injustice we refuse to confront.